What's up, everyone? Welcome to Let Loose Podcast, the podcast dedicated to all things Gym Leader Challenge in the Pokemon TCG. I am your host, Jeff Beisch, and we've got another wonderful co-host today. We've got Watto. Watto, what's up?
Hello, how's it going?
Hey, it's going great, dude. So happy to have you on. People, I don't know, you'd have to be following me for a while to know that I think maybe either the very first person or the very second person that I ever played in a tournament was you. It was my,
was it actually? I didn't even know that.
Yeah,
That's funny.
My Hitmon Bros run that kind of launched me as a content creator. You were like my second or third opponent playing Turbo Fairy, and you got
that the one you donked my Cottony or something?
I think it was like turn 2.
That one?
Or it was like kind of a donk. Like I could have had the donk if I had sequenced a little bit better, but like you were playing Turbo Fairy and you just drew super poorly. But like the next tournament, you just straight up smoked me. So it wasn't even like a contest. But that was kind of our first interaction. So I'm super excited to have you on the stream because there's a lot of like Beisch history with Watto here. But the people
glad to be here.
Yeah, the people need to know Watto. I mean, you're kind of like you're GLC famous. Like very GLC famous.
I don't know if I'd go that far.
I
have 2 decks.
You've got 2 decks, but people love your 2 decks. I think your 2 decks might have more love than like any other deck. Like especially with the stronghold that Fairy has and the fact that like you have a Fairy list that people love. So the people need to know about you, Watto. Tell us about yourself, favorite decks, how long you've been playing Gym Leader Challenge, all the stuff that you want us to talk about. And while you're doing that, let me pull up Turbo Fairy on the screen here just so that people can see the face with the deck.
Yeah, so I started GLC. I actually hadn't played the card game. Like I played when I was really young back in 2013. I went to standard events. I was like 11 or 12 at the time, and then I kind of kept up with what was going on in the card game. And then I didn't really get back into playing until last August. For GLC, I saw like a Tricky Gym video and I was like, wow, this looks cool. I wasn't ever really a fan of the standard format, so I got back into that and started playing, and I saw everybody hated Fairy, so I was like, I think I'm a pretty good deck builder. I'm going to build a Fairy deck. And I actually started with Fairy Control because I thought that would be the stronger way to play Fairy, but I quickly realized how much people will hate you if you play that deck. And I kind of got tired of people hating me, so I decided I had 2 ideas when I looked at the card pool, and the second idea was making the Togekiss deck, so I built that after, and that's the one I kind of had a lot of fun playing, so I just kept that one, got rid of the control deck, and yeah, that's kind of how I got into it. And then later on, my second deck, I like Chandelure, had a cool ultra rare card, so I just built a deck around that, and it seemed to be strong. So that's my main deck now. Yeah, that's pretty much it, I would say.
Your Chandelure deck, which we're going to talk to today, is one of the reasons why we're having you on today to talk spread decks. Because we're going to talk about spreading the love in Gym Leader Challenge today and all the sweet spread decks. But your Chandelure deck is one of the sweetest. Obviously, you have some love for Fairy. Is Chandelure one of your favorites?
It's probably actually my favorite Pokemon now. Used to be Victini, but I actually have a shiny Chandelure in Pokemon Sword and Shield too that got me. I played ranked ladder for singles for a bit in that game, and it got me globally ranked. And then I started playing GLC, and it won a lot of tournaments for me. So it's kind of become my favorite Pokemon, just I guess from playing and it being part of me winning. And the Chandelure in the GLC deck too is shiny, which is kind of funny.
That's awesome.
Just like the one in the game, yeah.
Yeah, I've actually never noticed that. People don't know this, but I'm colorblind. So when it comes to like shinies and shining hunting, like I did not tell the difference between regular Pokemon and their shiny versions.
See, my parents told me I'm colorblind too, but I don't really know what that means because I can still see colors, so I don't really get it.
Yeah, it's all, I mean, obviously this could be a whole nother podcast episode, but it's all just like different hues of different colors. Like I have a red deficiency, so like blue and purple look the same to me. That's how I always talk about it to people. But that's why I've never really been big into shining hunting. Like they didn't have the little like shiny animation going on, like I probably wouldn't notice. Yeah. So, but that's awesome. Yeah, Chandelure is pretty sweet, and that deck is a menace. Like you have beaten me countless times playing that Chandelure, and it's a different type of Strud deck than what people are used to. But yeah, let's talk about it. And let's before we get into that, because you've recently changed your Discord name. I don't know if everyone knows this or not, but you are no longer Watto in the Discord. You are now Marshadow's defense attorney. And there's a lot of stuff going on about whether or not Marshadow should remain in the format. And I feel like I just needed this moment because you've got a lot of opinions about Marshadow. What do you think? Good or bad for the format? Should it stay or should it go? Obviously, these are all leading questions. Watto, tell us about it.
Yeah. I know people don't like playing against it, and I can understand that point, but that's really the only valid point you have, in my opinion. I know everything has probably already been said, so I'm not going to repeat myself or anything other people who are defending the card have already said in the Tricky Dim or the Cardboard Warriors Discords. But yeah, if you compare Marshadow to anything else on the ban list, then I don't think this point has really been made. At least I haven't seen it before, so I'm making it now. It's really not comparable at all. People say Marshadow doesn't let you play the game, and I mean that's like kind of true, but not really, because when you compare it to the cards that are banned that actually don't let you play the game, it's part of a combo that doesn't let you do anything. Orangaroo, Chip Chip, Ice Axe, Hiker. Those cards don't actually let you play the game at all, whereas Marshadow, you just have to draw out of it. And the other cards that are banned that are just too strong, like Amazing Kyogre, compare that to Marshadow. There's no way. I know they do different things, like one's an attacker, one is a support, but what else is on the ban list? I forgot.
Pokemon Research Lab is on there. Force Giant Plants, some evolution cheating cards there.
Yeah, those are pretty broken as well. I guess those are some other than Force of Giant Plants. That thing should never have existed. Research Lab, I guess, is the closest in power level, I would say, to Marshadow. It's still a stronger effect because you could get Archeops into play by like turn 2. Whereas if you compare that to a turn 1 Marshadow, I feel like turn 2 Archeops is way stronger than a turn 1 Marshadow. I don't know. I'm just rambling here at this point, but yeah.
It's been said, like you said, but you've been the most adamant in defending it. So I think people just need to hear that. Most of the people that I have on the stream are for banning Marshadow. Like most of the people that I talk to in general are for banning it. So
I can understand people not wanting to play against it. Yeah, totally fair.
Yeah, that's really my only concern for banning it. And again, you said it too, is like it's a not fun card to a certain degree. And I don't want little Timmy. This is what Z-Man said like our first week of the podcast. He was like, I don't want little Timmy to get like kind of sad in the format and think that that's what the format's all about if he gets Marshadow turn 1. I'm like, okay, maybe for like a GLC growth standpoint, getting rid of turn 1 Marshadow is good. But I think competitively,
I would argue little Timmy would rather be turn 1 Marshadow than turn 2 Amazing Raikou.
That's fair. And hey, that's for another day. With Crispin and that Joltik coming up, that's a whole nother episode, Watto. We'll have you back for that one, maybe. But yeah, cool. Good to hear your thoughts on Marshadow before we get into the crust of it. And that's, again, spreading the love is what we're going to be talking about today. And we're going to be talking about spread decks in Gym Leader Challenge. Watto, you a spread enjoyer? I know that Dusk Buddies is kind of a spread deck. What are your thoughts on spread in the whole?
Spread, I would say, is really fun to play, but it's not as strong as your typical big basic attacking decks, I would say, and it also struggles into those decks specifically. It's better against decks that have low HP and evolving Pokemon that you can get rid of early, or like with stuff like Lost Zone that you can bring back into play with Target Whistle and Echoing Horn, I think they're called. But yeah, they're a ton of fun to play. They're definitely viable. They're just not the strongest decks, I would think, in the format, in my opinion, right now at least.
Yeah, and they're, again, I'm a big spread enjoyer, and I love them a lot. And these sort of decks, because of what they're trying to do, don't really allow you to like make too many mistakes. Like there's a lot of tempo that goes into these decks. Like you have to make a lot of right decisions on right turns in order to kind of take the KOs that you need in order to win the game or navigate what your opponent's doing. And sometimes it's out of your hands based on what your opponent is doing. So spread decks are fun. Spread decks are good. It's my favorite way to play. And coming from a different card game, I'm coming from Magic the Gathering to Pokemon. like spread decks are so unique in the trading card space. So the fact that like your bench can be used as a resource to a certain degree in these matchups, like the bench barrier fighting is really fun to me, like where you're going to bump stadiums and not, like it just feels like a really unique space that other card games don't have. And that's what initially drew me to it. And it's why I can't leave it.
Yeah, for sure.
Let's talk. So spread decks in general, just so that people know, people that are maybe newer to the format and haven't played Pokemon too much, spread decks are obviously looking to spread damage to all of your opponent's Pokemon. There's even some mons that will spread them to yours, which is kind of sad. We'll see that maybe with a Raichu and Lightning coming up here. But on our screen are some of the better options that we'll talk more in depth about. But you're looking like 10 to your opponent's Pokemon, 20, 30, 50 is I think where most things cap out. And there is one card on my screen that is banned, Amazing Rare Kyogre, who did 80 to all of your opponent's Pokemon. It took 4 energy of all different colors to do it, but it was actually easier than people thought with like Melodic and all these things. So Amazing Rare Kyogre got horseshoed out of the format, but again, 80 to everything, that was where the cap was at. We're at a much lower rate for spread decks now. I think 50 is our max going forward.
If Amazing Rare Kyogre was still in the format, I would say spread would be absurdly strong, but just that deck in particular, did it like I wasn't around. I actually started GLC after, but I feel like it got turn 2 or turn 3 Amazing Surges pretty consistently with the Melodic, which is pretty insane. It has a good amount of HP too. Like, imagine that thing with Luxurious Cape. Like, no, thank you.
It's kind of bonkers, and not every type has a good way to deal with it, which is one of the reasons why I think it did have to go from the format. Like, if every type had a bench barrier, again, which we'll talk about coming up, like maybe it gets a little bit different, but people were like, yeah, you just got to boss up the Phoebus, or like toy catcher up the Phoebus is like the way to deal with the deck, because Phoebus
I remember the
protects,
toy catcher.
Yeah, it protects itself on the bench, so it's just like, what are we going to do? So it's just kind of weird how these conversations have gone, and now we're kind of full circle. The band talks are great, and sometimes they happen. Kyogre obviously deserved it. But we got to talk about spread versus snipe here too, because spread is to all of your opponent's Pokemon, and that's a really powerful effect. But you'll see like snipe-based decks, which are a lot more targeted to your opponent's deck, pop up in more like mid-rangey box lists, like this Kyogre, which is not the Amazing Rare Kyogre, the other one, the Wave Summoning Dynamic Wave Kyogre. It does 180 damage to any of your opponent's Pokemon, whether that's active or bench. This is a lot more targeted than what Kyogre is trying to do. So Kyogre, the Amazing Rare Kyogre, is trying to, take care of all of your opponent's Pokemons maybe over the course of 2 turns, where Kyogre is like, I see your important bench Pokemon, I'm going to get rid of that. And it's a very different strategy that you can't really, you can't really equivocate to a certain degree.
Yeah, for sure. I think Snipe is actually a lot stronger than Spread, at least damage spread, because the problem with damage spread compared to Snipe is you need something that counters a potential bench barrier for multiple turns in a row instead of just the one turn you want to snipe. So say you're like using a Rainy Form, Cast Form, and you want to try and loop that every turn, you need bench barrier gone every turn. Whereas if you're just using Kyogre once for a dynamic wave to get rid of like a key support Pokemon, then you only need to get rid of that bench barrier for one turn.
And snipe damage, too, is just typically higher. Like, I think of a deck that's been performing well recently, Hitmonbros. On turn 2, you have Hitmonlee's 90 to the bench. Like, that is such an important turn for the Hitmonbros deck. And being able to take care of, like, almost every single support Pokemon in the format. I think I mentioned it so often. Octillery, 90 HP. Drizzile, 90 HP. Like, these are key Pokemon in water that you were to get rid of. It's great. And because it's a snipe effect, like you mentioned, you only have to pop down something to get rid of Manaphy's effect for that one turn. You can even take care of Manaphy in that one turn to allow you to maybe spread another turn. So Snipe is just really busted. I think most decks these days have some way, shape, or form to go after a Pokemon's or an opponent's bench. Whereas like spread, you really have to build your entire strategy around spread for it to be productive to a certain degree.
Yeah, that's a valid point for sure.
Well, spread has like some common things that it needs to do. And like across all spread decks that we're going to talk about today, these are things that they have to and want to do. So I think spread early is the game plan. You're going to have cheap attackers. I know that you and I both, I don't want to say love, but maybe deal with this Meloetta here with the Soprano Wave attack, that for 1 energy does 10 damage for each coin flip. You get to flip 3. So again, a cheap early spreader. You got Tapu Koko. Enlightening, 2 energy does 20 everywhere. And then Ting Lu, that's kind of been a menace to me recently. 1 energy does 30 to the active, and then if you have a stadium and can discard it, it does 30 to everywhere. 1 energy 30 is pretty busted.
30 everywhere, that is if you think about, like, sometimes I compare spread attackers to, like, normal attackers with, like, I say DPS. Meloetta can do, like, say they have 5 bench, 1 in the active. If you flip 3 heads, you're doing, what is that, 30, like 180 damage for 1 energy. And Ting Lu just does that every turn. It only needs a stadium card. So if you could just get a stadium into play every turn and keep that guy healthy, you are doing a ton of damage everywhere for just 1 energy, right?
Yeah, and it's so disruptive because, like, the 30 everywhere, if you're not evolving your 60 HP basics on turn 2 and you let this Ting Lu get 1 or 2 spreads off, even if it doesn't get a stadium discarded after that, it's just bonkers, like, what it's done to you and your setup at that point if it's able to take a couple KOs early. I was playing Tynamo against this list, this Ting Lu list, 30 HP free retreat Tynamo. You can just never bench it in the face of fighting spread because of this Ting Lu. Just like it comes down and it's a free KO, especially early. So it's like a very, very, like, I don't think of fighting spread as a great deck, but it can be a menace if it has the right start, and this Ting Lu can just carry. So spreading early, really key. And if you're an opponent and you're just sitting there ticking up counters every turn from the first turn of the game, things get really scary, especially if you're one of those setup decks that needs your bench to do work for you.
Yeah, people definitely underestimate the power of early spread. Like, I've played against a ton of people with my spread deck where I've got attacking turn 2. They're taking their time to set up. You're like, oh, he's not taking any knockouts, just getting a few damage counters in play. But the more damage counters you get in play early, the easier it is to win later. And I think a lot of people inexperienced with the spread matchup definitely underestimate that and don't prioritize attacking as early as they should.
100% agree. Another thing that spread decks do really well, because like you mentioned, they're not taking early KOs, is they're kind of like, they can slow down the game and they can disrupt it. And they can disrupt it in a lot of different ways. Obviously, the 3 disruption draw supporters see a lot of play in almost every single spread deck. Iono, In, Marnie, like, you're almost always drawing 6 cards and your opponent's probably going to like 4 or 3 at some point. So it's just really good. On top of that, you like to let your opponent's, like, decks work for you in spread decks. So, like, your opponent's trying to attack in, well, you've got cards like Spell Tag or Vengeful Punch, which can put damage counters on your opponent's Pokemon if they're looking to take KOs on your cheap early spreaders. And then some decks are looking to kind of add to what they're already doing with the spread Pokemon that they're playing. And you're going to see cards like Old Cemetery and Frozen City, which can damage on attachments. Well, if you're a Water Rain Dance deck who's trying to attach 3 or 4 energies per turn, and you see an Old Cemetery or Frozen City, and those water decks only play like Brooklet Hill as their only stadium sometimes, like, those can stick around and they can do work too. So disrupting, Wada, what do you think? Are you looking to disrupt early with your
every turn, give me that. Yeah. Another thing you can do with spread decks too is a lot of decks will have cards that or support Pokemon that fill their hand to like 4 or 5, like Octillery, Water, Bibarel, Colorless. You could even see Electrode or I guess Substrika and Lightning. If you knock out, like, it's easy to knock out those Pokemon on the same turn you use a disruption supporter by spreading because you're hitting the bench every turn. And if you do that and say like you Marnie same turn, N or Iono, or even in Psychic you have Marshadow, that's part of the reason what makes it so good in spread decks too, is you're getting rid of their draw and at the same time limiting their hand. They have very few options after that turn usually, and sometimes you just win right then and there, to be honest.
Yeah, 90 HP is a pretty easy number for these spread decks to hit, so Octillery definitely in danger. Bidoof, Barrel is one of the harder draw engines to deal with just because the Bidoof protects itself from damage, not necessarily damage counters. So there's that, but obviously getting rid of those Pokemon is definitely key. When you're playing a spread deck and when you're building a spread deck, you always have to think about what your opponents are doing. Like, your deck is there to do its thing, but like, you obviously are a more reactive deck than what a lot of other decks are trying to do. You're hoping that your opponent is proactive so that you can do your reactive stuff. So sometimes your opponent's going to be playing bench barrier. Well, you got to deal with that because it shuts off your entire strategy. We got two main ways here that you're going to be dealing with bench barriers. You got Silent Lab, which turns off basic abilities in play, hand, or discard pile. And so that's really good because Manaphy and Mew, which we'll talk about later, are the two big bench barriers that see play. It shuts them off. Of course, you're going to want to play that with Lusamine, which lets you get back 2 stadiums or supporters in any combination to your hand. So you can Silent Lab, bump, play Lusamine, get it back. Things are good. And then Hex Maniac is another way. There's a couple of evolution bench barriers too, mainly Machoke, that can cause some issues. So Hex Maniac can help out there. What do you think? I revel the bench barrier Silent Lab Hex Maniac battle. Are you the same way, Watto?
I tried to build a water spread deck one time, and as soon as I ran into bench barrier, I was so cooked. Like, I know I run the Silent Lab and the Lusamine, but it's just such a pain to get them every turn if your opponent's bumping your stadium. So I just kind of, like, I know you can make it work, but I kind of gave up on that and just went for Psychic, because Psychic doesn't care. You just spread damage counters, right? And that's what I like about Psychic so much. But this kind of brings me back to my point, spread versus snipe earlier. I feel it's really hard to make spread decks work that are just doing damage instead of damage counters, because you need the Silent Lab every turn or to loop Hex Maniacs. Whereas in snipe, you're just one turn and you're good to go, right? But I know there are a lot of players that make damage spread decks, not the damage counter spread, work for sure. It's just not kind of my thing, so I think I'll stick to Psychic, to be honest.
I definitely get you there. I've been playing a lot of Lightning Spread recently, and I had a game where like I had to get Silent Lab back 3 different times, and it was a great game. I was playing Moomin Latte, and they were playing Psychic, which is one of the harder matchups for damage spread, just because they're playing bench barrier, and they play a good bit of supporter search that can get them Lusamine to get them back, like Dimension Valley or something like that. And so I think I was like, Silent Lab, bump, Lusamine, get it back. Cynthia and Caitlin, get back Lusamine to get back Silent Lab. Like, over the course of like 3 or 4 different turns, I was able to play Silent Lab 3 times and spread 50 damage with Electivire. So, I really like that to a certain degree.
Yeah.
But I also had Zeb Strike every turn, discarding.
That's the advantages forward with those types, I guess, is they actually, most of them do more damage than Psychic, but the advantage to Psychic is you don't have to worry about the bench barrier, so it's really just what your preference, what you want to play.
I mean, we'll talk about what we think the best type is, but I think you listeners probably already know we're probably looking towards the Psychic type, which is maybe just all of Gym Leader Challenge. Well, after you deal with your bench barriers, after you've been spreading early, you gotta win the game with spread decks. And so you gotta take those multi-prize turns. Psychic has a ton of them, Watto, and you're kind of the Psychic expert. What's your preferred way for the multi-prize turns, and what are other people doing in the Psychic type to get them?
So the deck I use in Psychic, it's on the screen right there, but my big 2 players for winning the game, Chandelure, that if you get up early, it could, if you get it before your opponent takes a knockout in play, they don't boss it or anything all game. That is essentially 150 extra damage or 15 damage counters you're placing throughout the game. And that's like you put them anywhere. So that helps you take knockouts. Along with the Blacephalon on the 3 prize turn, like Sableye, except only on the 3 prize turn, you get to place 12 damage counters anywhere, which is really important for finishing key, like you spread early and then you need to pinpoint where the rest of the damage counters go to knock them out. That's what I do with my spread deck to finish KOs, but there are lots of other ways to do it. Do you want to take it over for here and explain Lunala and Dusk Noir?
Yeah, so I'm a big Dust Noir person. Obviously, we've got a new Dust Noir that's just coming out in whatever the next set is, Fable Shroud, which I think is out maybe this week. But Dust Noir, the one that we have on hand is Sinister Hand, and it lets you manipulate damage counters on your opponent's Pokemon as you'd like, so you can just move them anywhere. So Dust Noir lets you be really precise with it, in the same vein that Chandelure could, but you're looking to maybe like set numbers to specific points, and then maybe you're going to use TM Devolution here that's on the screen, and then devolve everything with those precise numbers that you need, not wasting a single damage counter, and then you're going to take maybe 4 or 5 knockouts in a turn, and maybe you just need to kind of navigate 1 or 2 more prizes if you're going the Dust Noir right. Lunala is super fun. I do think that Lunala is the hardest to set up. It's basically a double colorless energy, and it lets you double the number of damage counters on a Pokemon. So you need to go ahead and kind of get your spreading in, and then hopefully Lunala can just wipe your opponent's board in one turn, because as a stage 2 that needs to be in the active to attack, your opponents can see Lunala coming from a mile away. Kind of the same way that Dusk Noir could. It just the Dusk Skull lets it evolve itself into Dusclops, so you get a little bit of advantage, and you can also use Dusk Noir on the earlier turns to kind of help you navigate some certain situations that Lunala can't. So multi-prize turns, Psychic's got them, got lots of different options. We didn't even mention Psychic Lost Zone. I don't really feel like that's a spread deck, because it's more of like
it's a mix of spread and snipe.
Yeah.
It's hard to explain. Yeah,
it's like a linear combo deck that it very rarely is it like I'm going to put a couple damage counters everywhere. It's more like put 9 here and 3 there, and it's just weird. So maybe a whole different episode about that. Other decks have a tougher time, but they've got some cool ways to take multi-prize turns. We're going to see Lightning Spread coming up. Regieleki is kind of cool in what it does. 120 to the active and then 40 to 2 things on the bench. So it can kind of take care of an active and mop up things that maybe your Electivire, Raichu, Tapu Koko put damage counters on earlier. And then what's come up recently with Paradox Rift and later printings is we've got the TMs. And the TMs, specifically Crisis Punch and Blindside, and maybe even Devolution TM to a certain degree, work really well with these ancient trait Pokemon. So like Bunnelby, Torchic, Articuno. The Bunnelby and Torchic have the Barrage ability, so they can attack twice. And then Articuno has the Delta Plus. It gets an extra prize. So you put Blindside powered up with either of these Pokemon, you could take 2 prizes those turns, and it just change how the game has gone after you put damage counters on them. So pretty unique, pretty cool.
Thing with the barrage guys too is if you're using Blindside or something, unlike the Delta Plus, you're removing 2 Pokemon, which is very disruptive as well. You're not just taking extra prizes. You could say you shut off their bench barrier, you could get rid of the bench barrier and their draw guy, like Octillery or something, in the same turn, which can really screw up your opponent's next turn or something.
You mentioned water spread. I've been playing a water spread deck. So shout out to Mickey. Mickey made his Krabby water spread deck, and Krabby is my favorite Pokemon. So I kind of took it into my hands. Was like, I'm going to play this. So I've been trying to use that, and he was playing Articuno Blindside. It's actually pretty sweet. I've been able to do it like twice in a game before to take 4 prizes with Articuno. It's just those other 2 prizes that can be an issue, especially with... Well, okay. Some decks just feel like it's impossible to beat spread. And I don't know, oftentimes newer players will struggle with the spread archetype. I think veteran players maybe scoff at spread a bit, but I feel like there's still room for there to be. But beating spread, it can be a tall task depending on what list you're playing. So, I don't know. Beating spread, I think the best thing, and I talked about this earlier, your bench is a resource, right? Like those spaces on your bench, that's another facet of the game that we don't really talk about too much, like leaving spots open, staggering your benching. I think if you want to beat spread, the best way to go about it, even if you're not playing other tools to do it, stagger your benching, slow your game plan down. They're not going to be taking early KOs. Put down 1 evolution mon here. If you're able to get that evolution early, go for it. But don't play into the spread game plan.
For sure, yeah. I think if you want to be a better GLC player too, you should, instead of trying to execute your deck strategy every game, think more about what will actually win you the game. And against spread, Like, I know I've done this with my fairy deck. That's my non-spread deck into spread decks. Is a lot of the time, like in a normal game against any other deck, I'd want to fill my bench with all my support Pokemon, have all my tools and my resources. But against spread, a lot of the time, all you need is an early attacker. And if you only have like your early attacker and maybe 1 or 2 support Pokemon on the bench, then you're taking knockouts still from an early turn. You may not have your full toolbox available to you with all your support Pokemon abilities on the bench, but you're also like heavily preventing how many prizes your opponent can take, which will win you a lot of games, I think. So it's just something to keep in mind when playing against a spread deck.
Good points there. Yeah, just stagger the bench. And I love that you mentioned it. Just like don't try to do the same thing every time. Like, I'm playing against Stack Attack, and he's playing this Fire list. And he's got, like, Macargo, maybe some other important Pokemon in there. But the deck can function without Macargo. He's got these bigger basics. He's got Moltres. He's got Ho-Oh that can kind of chip in damage, take some KOs. He doesn't have to play all his basic attackers out early. They're relatively low-cost attackers, so he can afford that in his deck. He doesn't need to go all out on a Charizard strategy if that's not what's going to get him the win. He's got time to attach. So... Again,
if your attacker's not going down every turn, you don't need the support Pokemon that are going to find you the pieces to set up another one, because it's just going to be in the active every turn, right?
Exactly, yeah. And just like being aggressive, right? That's another thing too. If you're playing against a spread deck, being aggressive as you stagger your bench is a recipe for success. I think that's one of the reasons why you'll hear people say, spread is dead to a certain degree, because I do think very skilled players, even without certain tools, can still get around it. But I do think the best spread decks out there have ways to navigate and maybe kind of diverge from their spread game plans too, which we'll talk about when we get into especially your list and a little bit into some of the other lists we talk about later on. The other way is, hey, if you're a type that's lucky enough to have it, play Bench Barrier. Like, I can't say this enough. Like, having one card in your deck that shuts off an entire strategy is a very, very low cost to a certain degree. And some of these are really, really, really good anyway, just by themselves. Some of these, I put them up here, but you'll never play them. Like, for example, Mew, Bench Barrier Mew is just a bonkers card. 1 retreat cost, 1 energy. It's a colorless energy too. It doesn't have to be psychic, so it works with dimension values reduction. 3 damage counters wherever you like. Like, that plays into your spread game plan. Or if you're a psychic deck that's typically hitting for 160 and you need to hit a Torterra, over the course of 2 attacks, you could get there with just this Mew. So like, Mew is pretty good already. Some people that want to play a different Mew will actually play the psychic Mr. Mime. That's great. There's also a fairy Mr. Mime, which is weird because there's not actually a fairy Mr. Mime in the game, so I don't know how that
Very
happened.
important for fairy control, but we won't get into that one.
Other things like Machoke is like super bench barrier. It's not just damage, it's damage counters, and then it's not just from attacks, it's also from abilities, so it shuts down your Chandelure.
Yeah, I hate that one, I'm going to be honest. That's a tough matchup, which is kind of funny because Psychic has weakness into fighting, but...
Yeah, if you get a Machoke going early and early disruption as a fighting player, you can win games that you would expect. So Machoke is a key part of that, and it evolves into Crisis Muscles Machamp, which is just like one of the best attackers that fighting has at its disposal. The other ones on here are a little bit like Chip and Chop. You've got Bronzong, which this Metal Fortress Bronzong, like, you're never going to play over any of the other Bronzongs, but it's nice to have as an option. Manaphy probably sees the most play, in all honesty, just because water does like to fill its bench, and Octillery and Drizzile are really important to their core strategy. So having Manaphy as a backup, and then so many times they like to discard cards with like Ultra Bar, Superior Energy Retrieval. Like, Manaphy can just be fodder in the bad matchup. So Manaphy comes at a very low cost in water, just like Mew and Psychic. The bottom row there, like Thundurus, reasonable
I laughed
attacker.
a bit when I saw Thundurus on here. I was like, it does have bench barrier, but it also does 90 damage to itself, which is kind of not great into a spread deck, I'm going to be honest.
Yeah,
it's kind of funny how that card works.
Thundurus is a very I don't even know if it's balanced, to be honest, because it is so one-sided after it attacks. Now, it is really cool that it's not just useless, right? Like, Manaphy can just be useless, right? Thundurus can at least almost always take a KO, right?
Yep.
2 energy, which is something that lightning doesn't have a lot of because most of lightning attacks are 3 energy to do big damage. Well, for just 2 attach, it does 140. Downside, 90 to itself. So, it's a tough one, but who knows? I've seen people use Thunderous as bench barrier. Jirachi is basically just Lost Zone stopper and standard, and it exists in Gym Leader Challenge. I haven't seen it yet, but it exists. Rabska is always the interesting one for me. So Rabska is very similar to Machoke. It's super bench barrier. It's only 70 HP on a stage 1, so it actually gets around Silent Lab, but if you're playing grass, you've got the 40 HP buffed Cricketune. So you kind of have to decide, are you buffing your HPs on your Pokemon, which might be better into a 1-to-1 prize deck, or are you going to play Raska to help you in maybe Devolution, TM, spread deck? So I just don't know. I haven't seen Rabska pop up in too many lists. It feels like Cricketune is still the preferred card.
I've played against Rabska at locals when my locals will still pop, and just because I've played my spread deck so much. And it's definitely strong. It helps the matchup, but committing 2 cards to something you're not going to play against too often is say you're going to NAIC or something when they have the next big GLC tournaments. It's probably not worth including in your grass deck. Probably better just to go with something more consistent, or the Cricketune, like you said, that's good in all matchups.
Yeah, I think that's the way. I'll always say play your bench bear, but I'm also the spread guy at my locals. It feels like at every locals, there's just one guy who shows up and plays spread. It feels like you're that guy at your locals. I'm that guy at my locals. People will play bench bear to stop us, and if we're not playing spread, dead card. So I do like the Cricketune. Levani is another card in grass that reduces damage by 40. There's actually in almost every single type, there is a whole splattering of damage reduction cards, like Entei and Fire reduces damage by 20 less. There's the spread Arceus that reduces damage by 30 less and has a spread attack. There are all these Pokemon that do reduce damage too, so those Pokemon could also potentially be good ways as a bench barrier or bench protection too. If your type doesn't have a bench barrier, though, there are 2 stadiums that exist that are kind of interesting. You've got Sky Pillar, which prevents all effects of opponent's attacks, including damage, to your bench Pokemon. Actually, it's both bench Pokemon. And there's Mountain Ring that prevents all damage. So you'll see Mountain Ring sometimes played in the Earthquake builds, which is odd because they don't want to damage their own bench. And then Sky Pillar is a card I play it in Ursaluna, just because my support Pokemon in Ursaluna are so tiny, and I auto lose to spread decks without it.
Yeah, it's definitely, I would say, only viable in control decks in my opinion, because those decks it's really easy to get back in play because you have lots of ways to recover resources from the discard. I would say if you're playing a normal attacking deck that doesn't run Lusamine or anything that's going to get it back, all your opponent really needs to do to counter that is remove your stadium by playing their own stadium, or Field Blower or something, and then it's just gone and they can spread their damage. So it's not the greatest counter to spread decks, ironically, but if you're running something that can recover it and you can win the stadium war, it will win you games against spread decks. It just depends on if you're playing one of those decks, right?
Yeah, it is a very fragile way, but sometimes it's just that one turn that you need, right? You're playing against Hitmon Bros and they have the 3 consecutive turns, and you can play a Sky Pillar down on the Hitmon top turn and they can't find it. You've just reset their combo. So sometimes that one turn is enough, but I'm with you. I would much rather dedicate that spot maybe to something else, except Control, which my Ursaluna deck is kind of that. The other way, and as a spread player, these cards are the cards I hate to see the most. And that's Rough Seas. Rough Seas, any of these tank and heal cards really just wreck me. Rough Seas hurts so bad. And I've seen I've been playing against Metal, and they have the Metal Heal or the Metal Reduction Stadium because Metal has so much. And I've got Metal Goggles up here because Metal
Can't forget Crystal Cave either.
Crystal Cave too is ridiculous. So tank and heal cards are really tough for spread decks because, again, like I mentioned way earlier, they require you to kind of spread early. They want to keep up the tempo of attacking every turn, chipping away. And if you can undo just a whole turn, Rough Seas undoes 30 damage from one of their water Pokemon, that's like 1 or 2 or 3 turns of spread for some decks. Like if you Meloetta twice, this Rough Seas, plop it down, heal, and sometimes that's all you need. You don't need the Stadium to stick if you can heal that 1 turn. And it just feels really hard for spread decks to recover after these heal cards come down.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, these cards are your worst enemy. If they get this into play, even for just 1 turn, it's going to screw up your game plan a ton. You might not auto lose at that point, but some games it might be really hard to win. And if they get that card in play a second time with like Lucamine or something else to get that back, you are probably losing that game. So because of those cards, I've actually added Lost Vacuum to my spread deck. And I think that's something, if you're trying to play spread, you should keep in mind as an option, because especially into these decks, like I said, just 1 turn, you could probably still have a chance depending on how early you started to spread damage. So if you can Lost Vacuum that card and they can't get it back, it improves your chances of winning that game by a ton. But yeah, these cards, even if you have the tech for it, you really don't want to run into, and they're going to be hard matchups regardless.
Yeah, I think like Waylord and Water is one of like the toughest matchups. Like they're already
Waylord
playing
with Rough Seas.
Yeah, and they're playing Rough Seas. Some of the lists are playing Rough Seas. So like just imagine like Mallow and Lana and Rough Seas and all these cards, plus Wash Energy, which stops damage counters. It's a very, very tough matchup for spread decks, even Psychic Spread, to kind of deal with that. And taking heal strategies, let's not even get started. But, that's kind of like the core of it, right? Like that's how you play your spread deck. That's how you go about attacking spread decks if you're on the other end. But let's get into the spread decks that exist out there. We're not going to talk about every of them. So people out there can roast me in chat for leaving your deck.
We'd be here a while.
Yeah. But we're going to talk kind of about the ones that we're more familiar with, the ones that we think are going to be the most successful in kind of the current climate. And of course, we got to start with Watto's list. So Watto, why don't you talk us through, and I'll put your deck list here up on screen. Talk us through Dusk Buddies, your idea, your inspiration, how you go about playing the deck, key minds, key supporters. Tell us all about it.
Yeah, for sure. This is the second deck I made when I started playing GLC. Like I said, Chandelure is my favorite Pokemon, and when I went through the card database, like 3 damage counters every turn if it's in the active, that seems really broken, and I didn't see anybody who was building around this card. And so I gave it a shot myself, and turns out, yeah, it is really broken. If you are able to get this thing in play before your opponent takes a knockout, like I said earlier, if it doesn't get bossed or anything throughout the whole game, that is 15 damage counters you are placing throughout the match. That's like an extra Blacephalon turn where you're not even needing to attack. So if you can just keep this thing with a Floatstone on or something to retreat every turn, every time one of your guys gets knocked out, you pivot this thing to the active 3 damage counters. It just helps you do so much more damage, and that's really what you need to win with this deck. I'd say it is the win condition, but Blacephalon is just as much of a win condition. You might question like why this deck has Dimension Valley. It's literally just for Blacephalon. So like what you're kind of trying to do, it's very similar to other spread decks in that early game you're just trying to set up like a Meloetta or the Miss Magius to start spreading damage counters, and you're kind of just getting as much damage in play every turn as you can while you're disrupting your opponent's hand. So you're trying to stop them from bossing your support Pokemon, the Gallade and the Chandelure. That's why Luxurious Cape is in here too. You could Luxurious Cape your Gallade to keep that thing alive, or make them have to find a Field Blower if they want to boss knock it out. As well, even sometimes you can get that on the Chandelure because you play the Mystery Energy too, that gives it 2 less retreat costs. So if you get the Mystery Energy on your Chandelure, then you give that a Luxurious Cape, and then you know for sure that thing is going to be doing its ability every turn, unless your opponent finds like Field Blower boss, I guess. Yeah, that would do the trick, but a lot of that at that point, it's probably just better to boss the Gallade instead of the Chandelure with the Luxurious Cape, right? But yeah, you just spread damage every turn. You make sure you get your Blacephalon off when it is the 3 prize turn. Rosa's really good for that because you could search. Rosa searches out Blacephalon, Energy, and Dimension Valley, which is just the full combo in one turn, and you can find Rosa off of Gallade. And then late game, to stop a bad matchup Dark, because you're Psychic, I run the Nihiligo now, which copies an opponent's attack, any attack they have on the board for just 1 energy. And say they're attacking with a Guzzlord or something, then you can copy their Red Banquet. It really helps in the Dark matchup that way. And then I know Gallade's kind of a support Pokemon, but it's usually the last attacker if it's alive in the deck. After your Nihiligo, you're going to try and just finish the game off with a big swirling slice. The one thing I will say about this deck is after the 3 prize turn, it kind of transitions from a spread deck to just a normal attacking deck with your Chandelure for the last couple prizes, just trying to finish off 1 more knockout. Because the Nihiligo is probably just taking 1 knockout with like a big damage attack it's copying, and the same thing with Gallade. So it feels more like a toolbox deck than a spread deck for the entire match, which I think is really fun to play. But it is a little bit hard to play because of that, and I think if you want to like see results with this deck, you're going to definitely need to play it and give it some time to settle in. I think I really covered everything with it there.
This deck is awesome. I played against it a ton. Everything you said is exactly how our games have gone in the past. The Nihiligo is sweet because it just comes out of nowhere and wins games. The Gallade is just an attacker that at some points can just like take games over by itself. Wobbuffet slows down the game at times, and because
I didn't even mention that card.
Yeah, and because like you're placing damage counters with Chandelure, like your Wob can actively take KOs in different ways too. Like this deck just kind of has it all. And then, like you mentioned, you're using your opponent's attacks to help you get your combo, right? They take 3 prizes. 1 Rosa sets you up for a Blacephalon, and that Blacephalon turn is probably the most devastating turn in all of Gym Leader Challenge. Like, it just ends games on the spot. Even if there's a couple more prizes to take, if you don't skip that 3 prize turn, if you're playing against a Psychic Spread deck, you feel bad. Some interesting includes, Watto, that we need to hear about. And I think the one that people are looking at the screen, they're going, Apricorn Maker? Apricorn Maker? I need you to tell us why you're playing Apricorn Maker.
Hear me out. Yes, it's a bad card. Okay, that doesn't mean it's not a useful card in some situations, though. Psychic, I think, especially if you're playing the Kirlia Gallade, it's so good because you can Apricorn Maker. Yes, you don't get 3 Pokemon, but you get to choose between Hisui and Heavy Ball or like a Level Ball, Timer Ball, Ultra Ball, which will get you your Ralts out of the prizes and your Kirlia. Whereas, say you're playing like I know Clavel is used in Psychic a lot because it lets you get your basics and Marshadow, but Clavel will not let you get your Ralts from your prizes, so you can't start setting up your only support line that draws you cards. And it also won't let you get any evolutions, so no Kirlia off of Clavel. Whereas Apricorn Maker is just really good for, I don't know if consistency is the right word. It just finds you like specifically what you need rather than quantity, which I think is more important in this deck specifically.
I came around to it after like first being like, that card is trash, it's awful. Like
there will be people who always say it's trash, and that's fine by me. I just like it in this deck.
No, I like it a lot in Psychic too, because what you mentioned is just like how important Kirlia and Gallade are to this deck. So like having Ball Guy to maybe get you set up, and then maybe Apricorn Maker later on to grab like Timer Ball or Ultra Ball to get you an evolution. Like getting the evolution is the reason to play Apricorn Maker over something like a Gloria or a Clavel.
It's just a classic case of redundancy, right? And even if you don't use it, like say you get your Ball Guy, which you'd rather have anyway, then you could just refinement it away later, or Ultra Ball, toss it away, Lost Vacuum, get rid of it. It's just redundancy.
Get them now, chat. They're like $3, like full art. So get your Apricorn Maker. It's what art are you running? You're running an older art in your list, aren't you, Watto?
Here, wait, let me pull it out here for you.
All right.
I'll show the people at home.
People listening, I'll describe it to you. It's magical. It's wonderful.
It's very nice.
It's the best card you'll see today on a podcast dedicated to Gym Leader Challenge. Ooh, yeah.
Sheesh, got the hollow too.
Love it. Love it. But yeah, that's your list, Watto. I'm really impressed by it. You've always bragged about its consistency, and I've always lost to it consistently, so I'd have to agree. So kudos to you, sweet deck. Check it out. The only thing I'll have to say about Dusk Buddies is that Litwick is expensive.
Oh yeah, like $20 I hear. Well, I paid 15 for mine, but yeah, it's not cheap, and it's really not necessary. I only tack with it maybe like once in every 15, 20 games. Like, it's really not often. It's really good though in those few games that you are not drawing well. You start with it in the active, then you can call for family for your Ralts and like save something in your hand that will draw you cards later. Like, say you start, your only playable card is Level Ball, your Litwick's in the active, you call for family for your Ralts, next turn you have your Level Ball for Curlia. So if you want the best Litwick, you should probably play that one, but it's really not necessary if you just want to get this deck cheaply built. But it's definitely not the cheapest deck. I know the Chandelure is expensive too, so.
But worth it. I have them both. Unfortunately, they're just kind of sitting because I have like my psychic list built, which we'll talk about now. This is my take on it. And did I take some inspiration from you, Watto? Of course. I took a lot of inspiration from a lot of different decks. It's hard for me to pinpoint exactly. There were a couple of different Dusk Noir decks of the past that like really, really resonated with me, and I really wanted to play this card. And Dusk Skull has such a cool ability, like Spiritborn Evolution, discarding 3 cards in order to immediately evolve is really cool. And if you have discard synergies, like it's not that steep of a cost. So that was kind of my thought when I put my list together. And you'll notice there's a lot of common threads between our two decks. Azelf, Meloetta, Mew are all there. We both have to play the Miss Magus. It's just the best spreader in Psychic, and its ability
really broken ability, yeah.
Yeah, the ability is just so disruptive while adding to your game plan. And then, of course, you got to add the Gallade Kirlia line. And that's kind of where our list stops. Maybe Marshadow is in there too. And, of course, we both rely heavily on the 3-prize Blacephalon turn. And then I'm kind of like more in on putting things in the discard pile, bringing them back, adding spread damage to the board in different capacities. And so since I've got these discard synergies, we're playing Giratina with Distortion Door, which goes to the discard. You can bring it back to your bench, and it can put 2 damage counters or 1 damage counter on 2 of your opponent's Pokemon. So it can kind of help you hit numbers that you need to. And then when you're playing Dusk Noir, which lets you manipulate counters how you see fit, that Giratina continuously coming back can really play into it. Since I wanted to get like the most use out of discarding cards and Giratina being kind of a solid attacker, because for 3 energy it does do 130, I am playing Malamar, which I think is really kind of the glue of this deck, which is not super necessary in your build at all. Like, you cut it, you didn't need it. I feel like it's really, really necessary in this build because, like you mentioned,
depends if you have 1 energy attackers or not. Like, I don't know if you attack with Giratina consistently, but if you want to use that guy at all, you probably need the Malamar, right?
Yeah, and that's kind of where, like, if your opponent is staggering their bench, like we talked about earlier, like this deck can pivot to Giratina kind of easily, right? Like, you just get attachment from Malamar, maybe Dimension Valley, and in 1 turn you can get the Giratina hitting for 130. So this deck, I think, pivots a little bit more into a non-spread game plan than your deck does. And then because I was really worried about Snorlax when I built this list, and potentially like an early Snorlax, because Unfazed Fat just stops damage counters in their tracks, I'm playing the Mimikyu instead of the Nihilego, and it requires 2 energy. And so because of the Mimikyu, because of the Giratina, because I want Gallade to be an attacker, and I'm not playing Rosa like you are, I just really felt like the Malamar was the card I needed. So this is what my list looked like. And then since you're using Dusk Noir, I think the best way to use Dusk Noir is to also use Devo TM, which I think is a terrible card. Like, I actively think that Devolution TM is really bad in like 90% of matchups. But I think that Psychic Spread, like, because you can more precisely put counters where you want to, manipulate them, move them around, like, and you don't have to have a lot of waste. Like, you can move them around, and it's an ability, and then you can Devo TM that same turn. So this is like the only deck that I think Devolution TM is actually good in most of the time.
It's funny you say that. Terrible card, but hey, it's really important to this deck.
It could be a terrible deck, but I just got my Psychic badge with this, so,
I've played against your deck before too. The Devo TM with the Dusk Noir. It's like, it's not doing damage, but technically it is, because you're reducing the amount of HP you have. or your opponent has on their evolutions by so much, it's definitely very strong. Yeah.
Yeah. So I like it a lot. Besides that, you mentioned putting Luxurious Cape on Gallade, which I think is like the play 99% of the time. But like my favorite thing to do in these decks, and it's mostly wrong, is to throw it on Blacephalon to get an extra
I do
3
that once
prize
in a
turn.
while.
Yeah, it's usually comes back and bites you because 210 is not that hard, or they just feel blowered away and it doesn't matter anyway. But like getting a second 3 prize turn is just like the best feeling for you, and that's like watching your opponent's face. Like it can hurt sometimes if you're playing against that person, you like them, but sometimes it's very satisfying.
If you combine the Blacephalon Luxurious Cape with Hand Disruption, a lot of the time it will stick, so that is something to keep in mind too. It's just usually a better idea probably to keep your Gallade alive, but it's definitely a valid play. And if Blacephalon wasn't in the deck, maybe Luxurious Cape isn't in there, because that's probably the other big target you want to put the cape on, right?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, maybe in my build, Dusk Noir is a little bit more important to protect too. So I don't know. Luxurious
Cape, valid.
I've liked it in this list. Really, there's not a lot I would change in this list. I've got Hex in it currently. I'm always so back and forth with Hex in these lists because I don't want to Hex on Miss Magus turns. But like, while I'm like spreading damage, like stopping my opponent's abilities after I've used all mine is like can be really good and really important. I just like being able to get it on command with Gallade, like sometimes puts it in my deck, but I'm always like swapping Hex in and out. So if you see it on the list on the screen, it might not be in my final version right now, but Hex is always a card worth playing. I know you don't play it in your list. Is that the reason that Miss Magus?
I have Wobbuffet. But yeah, Miss Magus being combined with that, a lot of the time too, you want at least in my experience, you want your supporter for turn to help you get fully set up or to respond to one of your guys getting knocked out. But yeah, it's definitely a very strong card with Gallade. I just find I have Wobbuffet if I need to shut off key ability. I'll just pivot Wobbuffet to the active and then get that guy out of there again after, like, say they have an Okidogi. It has 13 damage counters already. If Wobbuffet goes to the active once, it's just knocked out anyway, and I don't have to waste my supporter for turn with a Hex or something. But yeah, it's definitely something to consider if you're running Gallade, because you can pick it out anytime you need it, right?
Let's talk about Lightning Spread. And out of all the spread decks, Lightning Spread has the highest damage output at the moment. We're going to
highest damage, but I would say also most vulnerable.
Okay. That's a very fair point to mention. But damage, it's there. And so the Electivire is really kind of the heart and soul of these Lightning Spread decks. So for 2 lightning and a colorless, it does 50 to everything on a stage 1 with 140 HP. So relatively high HP, high damage output, like you putting 300 damage out on the board potentially if your opponent's bench is full. And then if it survives another hit, you basically end games with 2 Electivire attacks. So DJ Backwards list is running kind of the usual suspects you'd see. You've got Zebstrika as your draw support. Sprint lets you discard your hand and draw 4 cards. You've got both Dynamotor effects, which lets you attach energy from your discard pile to your bench. You've got Electric and you've got Flaffy. And then you've got some other interesting spreaders. We talked about the Tapu Koko earlier, Regieleki as well. This list is also running Elekid, which for a free attack and free retreat does 30 to any of your opponent's Pokemon. Just one of them, though. And then you've got Minim, which I actually really like this Minim. It's 1 energy, 10 everywhere. I usually like that Minim when it's paired with the Raichu that does 50 to anything that has damage counters on it, because you can go Minim turn 1 and potentially Raichu on turn 2 if you get your Dynamotor set up. So 60 over the first 2 turns, which can be pretty brutal. And then an interesting include, which is this Morpeko, whose second attack here, Spark, for a lightning and a colorless, does 50 to the active and then 20 somewhere else. And then a secondary attack, which is actually its first attack up here, for 1 energy, it does Torment, which is 20, and it stops your opponent from using an attack. So it's kind of like a disable to a certain degree. Besides that, Lightning's got some pretty interesting support cards in it as well. Electro Power does 30 more to the active, so you could turn Electivire's 50 into 330 damage, doing 80 to the active if you need to. Sometimes you'll see Donk Zapdos ran as another way to deal with bench barriers, but they've also got Silent Lab here. And I do think that Lightning decks make the best use out of all the counter cards, like Counter Energy, Counter Gain, Counter Catcher. We all see them on DJ Backwards' list here. I run them in my list too. This list is great, but like you mentioned, sometimes it can fall short.
Yeah, for sure. This list actually, funnily enough, really struggles against other spread decks because everybody has so little HP. And like say against Psychic too, if they're running the Mew and they're also a spread deck, this deck has to fight into bench barrier as well as like disruption and potentially ability lock with Wobbuffet. But yeah, if you don't run into a hard counter like that, and especially if you don't run into bench barrier, you don't have to worry about finding your Silent Lab. If you draw well enough, you could potentially get a Electivire turn 2 and 50 to everything. If you get that going early enough, and if that hits for more than one turn, you're probably winning that game because that's just so much damage, right?
And you mentioned like bad matchups. You know, there's a video up of Weeder and I playing, you know, his Dusk Noir build from the new set that's coming out, and I was playing Lightning Spread into it, and I go like, you know, Zapdos donk his Mew that was wearing a spell tag, and then he puts a damage counter on each of my Pokemon, setting them up into that Dusclops 5 damage counter KO range.
Oh.
But it also stops me from ever being able to use the Raichu, because now each and every one of my Pokemon has a damage counter on it, so I can't use Raichu. And it was a very interesting matchup. It came down to a coin flip where I had like counter energy, counter gain on a Regieleki, and I was coin flipping into a Dragapult. So there's still game
sure,
there,
yeah.
But man, it was a hard matchup.
The Raichu is really interesting in my opinion, actually, because I feel like with Crystal Cave, if you're not against bench barrier, it's kind of just fine. Raichu's definitely an interesting option.
Yeah, I've been liking it a lot, but I do agree with the people that are not as high on it as I am, that like it's a little clunky at times. I was having a lot of poor prizing with this deck, and if you can't ever Electivire, you can't ever win games. And so I was like, well, I need a backup Electivire, and that's what Raichu was becoming. So it felt good in those matchups. Like I'm cooking Dragon all over the place with back-to-back 50 spread. Like they just have no bench barrier. Everything's at 120. It's like 50-50 and then a 20 Tapu Koko cleanup. It's just too free for the bean. But Raichu can be bad a lot of the time. Next list, I wanted to find a different list. This is my list that I put up here, but I really wanted to find, like Jeffrey has a great spread list. We've had him on. Mickey has a great fighting spread list. I couldn't find their list. They weren't up on CBW, so I went with mine. I used theirs as a lot of inspiration, so they get all the shout outs. I know there are a lot of other people out there that have been working on fighting spread, and this is different than Hitmon Bros that I normally talk about, because this is like a full-on spread strategy, and fighting has two of the best early cheap spreaders in the game. Ting Lu, a new card, again, Ground Crusher does 30 to the active. If you have a stadium in play, or if there's a stadium in play, it does 30 to everything, and you discard that stadium, which can make it awkward at times when you're going up against bench bears, because you do have to get rid of your own Silent Lab. So, trouble there. But you've also got Palisand that for 1 energy does 30 everywhere, which is great. And these are both 140 HP Pokemon, so like Electivire, if they stay in the active and can do this multiple turns, 60 over the first 2 turns is really good, because your opponent's not evolving everything, and then even into some big basics, that's setting them up for easy chip shots from other Pokemon. So beyond the spread, this deck is running like the Tyro with a Bratty Kick ability where you can flip a coin and do 3 damage counters if you get heads, but it ends your turn, and sometimes that Tyro can take care of a bench barrier over 2 turns just by flipping coins. You've got Machamp and Lucario as cheap attackers that can take KOs outside of your spreading, so you're not just all in. And then I opted to play the Hawlucha, which can put damage counters, because sometimes you run into like a Manaphy that has 70 HP, so if you can spread twice on the Manaphy with a Silent Lab, you can Hawlucha and put a damage counter on it if they manage to bump it. So, that's that. That's the fighting list. They're really simple. They've got tons of stadiums because they're playing Ting Lu. Martial Arts Dojo helps a ton if they're behind. Spread decks like to go behind. Silent Lab, Artisan, Brooklet Hill here. Really good tools as well. Luxurious Cape, Muscle Band, Focus Sash. If you're a damage spread deck, I think you do need Devoteum, and so this list is running it. And then, Strong Energy, Stone Energy. Just two really good special energies that Fighting has access to. 20 more damage from one, reduces damage the other. Fighting spread feels like a real deck these days. Watto, what do you feel?
I definitely agree. The thing I like about Fighting Spread compared to something like Psychic or Lightning is you don't have to set up anything. You just get down a basic, or it's just one evolution to Sand, one energy, and you're doing a ton of damage already. It's really low to the ground, easy to find with just a few limited search cards, which is really what Fighting needs without like a big draw support or something that searches something out every turn, like a Gallade or Dragonite. It's just really easy to get going, especially from turn 1 or turn 2 even. And I think that's what makes it strong. It just puts pressure on really early. The thing that a problem my opponents have had, at least when I played this deck, or played against it, I haven't played it myself, is sometimes it loses steam in the late game. And just like any fighting deck, late game hand disruption, it's really tough for you. You kind of have to rely a lot on the Machamp in the late game, I think, with this deck. But if you can get a big lead early on and start spreading damage really early, and if you can knock out some little guys or some little support Pokemon pretty early, I think you're going to be in a good spot to win that game. It's definitely not a joke of a deck, though, that's for sure. With the Tinglu and the Palossand now, you have a bunch of options for attacking with spread multiple turns in a row.
Yeah, that added redundancy is really important. And like you mentioned, it's just so low costed. Like one energy, like almost everything this deck attacks for one energy. The champ attacks for two, but like that's like just wait till Raihan typically in these fighting decks. And then the last thing, like you said, fighting just doesn't have that late game. Well, do you need a late game if you can do 30 on the first turn to everything?
Right? Yeah.
So that's where I think it is. I'm really excited to see where these decks go. I feel like they need one more piece, and I'm not sure what that piece will be. Maybe another cheap spreader. Maybe like a Pokemon that turns off bench barrier, because they're never any draw support too would be like a big boost for these decks. Yeah, it feels like it's going places. I'm excited to see where it goes in the future. Watto, last list that we're going to talk about, and we've got Fire Spread here, and I put Baba's name up on here because we're using his list, but I know that Spence has another version of his list too that's called Realm Keeper that he's been working on, so I think this is called Chicken McFly on the Cardboard Warriors website.
Something like that.
It's a really interesting list. I know you've played against us. Why don't you tell us about it?
This list, I thought Fire Spread was a joke for a long time, especially before I played against this deck. And it kind of was before the TMs got added, the Blindside and the Crisis Punch. Because Fire doesn't really have very many good spread attackers, but you don't need good spread attackers when you can just use your Torchic to attack twice with a Blindside or a Crisis Punch. So the first time I played against this deck, I was cruising thinking, oh, easy win, it's Fire Spread, right? And then the Torchic ended up taking like 4 prizes against me because it used Blindside and then later used Crisis Punch. It's just really strong. You really don't need to spread very much damage at all to be able to take a knockout with Blindside and Crisis Punch 280. Like, you don't need to spread at all and you're taking 2 knockouts, right? But the main way you would play this is you're trying to get your Reshiram, or what's that over there? That's Oricorio. Yeah, that's right. One of those guys early, just to put damage counters on everything, so your Torchic is able to use Blindside to knock out whatever it wants on the bench. This deck is a little vulnerable, just like any other fire deck, without Charizard, because without Charizard, it's really gonna be hard for you to set up your big 3 energy Blindside, Crisis Punch, or it will just totally stop you from using Heat more. But yeah, this deck may not be great at spreading a ton of damage every turn, but it's really good at hitting snipe shots and just taking multiple prizes later on a game on Pokemon that are damaged. And I was really impressed with how oppressing it felt when it drew well. It is a little bit greedy, but if it all goes to plan, this deck is very strong. And yeah, I just felt like I wanted to include it because I feel like not a lot of people actually know about this deck and haven't given Fire Spread a chance. So if this seems like something you would be interested in, definitely try it out. It's a lot of fun. It can definitely make it work.
And I played against Spence playing this list. I haven't played against Baba, but Spence was playing this list and he was cooking with it. I always kind of was in the same vein with you, where I thought that Fire Spread was not something that could really exist. There's not a lot of good, cheap spreaders like we've seen in the other types that we think we're going to see success. But that Torchic is pretty good. Heatmore is a monster, but like you mentioned, you need Charizard. I think the list that I kind of was cooking up was more of like a snipe-based list. That was more in on like Oricorio and then the Vulpix that can do 9 damage counters to something.
Isn't there a Moltres that does 120 snipe too, I think?
Yeah,
like you could use that as well.
Yeah, that was in my list too. So I was kind of in on a Fire Snipe list that was more of like the Xeno style that we see, kind of like a more traditional. I think I added elements of Weeder's Extreme Speed, but these are like deck lists that are really cool and are something I want to try out. And I do think that the Torchic TM space, even though it was talked a lot about at the beginning of Paradox Rift, is still really underexplored. And like you could even throw, like we see TM Evolution in this list. Like Torchic is not only a good finisher of games, it could also be your best starter at times. So I do think this list is cool. Give it a go. It's got some exciting things, like some cards too that you don't see played very often. Cards like Bill's Analysis, which lets you look at the top 7 and choose any trainer card into your hand. Or I think 2 trainer cards. You've got Peony to discard your hand and go get 2. But you've got Delphox to help you draw up to 6, which is a really cool include there. And then you've got Skyla, which I'm sure in part helps you get set up early, but might also help you set up, like turn off a bench barrier or, go get Countercatcher to stall the game or get one of those TMs. So this list has a lot of nuance to it, and I think it's going to take some work. Like you mentioned, your deck needing some reps. I think this deck is going to need some reps as well.
For sure, yeah.
Well, Watto, that leads us to here.
Yeah.
Best and worst types for spread. All right. You had to play a spread deck in a tournament. What deck are you picking? What's the best in your opinion?
Psychic. I'm picking Psychic just because I don't want to have to deal with bench barrier. I can just spread damage counters. I would say that probably is the best type if you want to play spread, but to be honest, I think all of them are viable. It just depends on kind of what your playstyle is, what you're willing to deal with. I think Psychic actually has the least pop off compared to other spread decks. It doesn't have the highest damaging spreaders other than the Blacephalon turn. There isn't too many crazy things you can do with spread attacks, whereas if you're comparing it to like Lightning, 50 damage a turn, or a turn 1 Ting Lu for 30 everywhere, that's a lot more damage than your Psychic guys could do. But they can do damage counters, and they don't care about bench barriers. So I would say if you want to win a tournament with the spread deck, Psychic's probably your best bet, but you can definitely make the other types work. And it doesn't necessarily mean they're weaker, it's just they have different weaknesses.
Yeah, I mean, you can't go away from Psychic. The damage counters, getting around bench barrier, just makes your life so much easier. Like you said, you don't have to worry about the Silent Lab in your deck. That's a whole nother spot you can save to do a cool tech, which these spread decks like to do in Disrupt. Psychic, by far the best. I don't think it's close. Unless you're playing against Dark. I think anytime that you're walking into a Guzzlord meta and you're, 70 HP Azelf is looking down at Guzzlord, like you're real sad. Like, so if you're in a Dark heavy meta, maybe avoid Psychic spread.
Is that part of the reason you have the Mimikyu in your Dark deck or in your Psychic deck too?
Yeah, Guzzlord's
like
definitely
Snorlax.
Yeah. Copycat attackers are pretty busted, and Psychic has the best too. And since they're so cheap attackers, Filch is a good starting too, like 1 energy draw 2 cards. Like Mimikyu is just so good in my head. And like the fact that it just stops Snorlax too was just added bonus. So I like Mimikyu a lot, but Nihilego also really good. Also
just being able to, for a spread deck, to be able to copy your opponent's attacks that take 2 prize cards really helps your prize trade a lot. It's just really good.
I mean, just imagine though, like Mimikyu, your opponent has that turn 2 Raikou. You just go Mew, you go Mew, Raihan into Mimikyu, and now you've got bench barrier protecting you, and you can 120, 120. I think I ended up doing that against someone where I Mimikyu'd their Raikou, and it flipped the game on its head, and it just felt
That's
so
pretty
good.
insane, yeah.
Worst type for spread, Watto. Where's your brain at for, like, there's a type out there that doesn't have a lot of support?
This might be a joke answer, but it's Fairy, because it literally only has like one card that spreads 10 everywhere. So maybe I pick another type, but that is definitely the worst if we're gonna be honest here.
All right. I mean,
other types that don't
fun.
have great spread, I would say like what? Metal probably. It has a cool Ferrothorn that I've wanted to build around, but it doesn't have much outside of that. So probably I would just say Metal.
Yeah, metal stuff. It has like the Earthworm that does like 100 and like extra damage to something on the bench, which
30 to something on the bench. That's not even spread at that point, right? It's just a little moving around.
But that's what people are trying to play in their metal spread decks. I feel like Grass is similar. Like Grass has some pretty cool tools. Like there's a jump fluff that can attack twice, and people have tried to like use that plus the old rapid strike tool that does 30 to everything twice, and like that plus like Celebi is pretty good. Those Grass spread decks, things just don't seem to like click the way I want them to do. And
Grass has the options. It's just needing to build around the jump up. It feels so greedy to me. Like I will never play that deck.
I love that. That deck has a special place in my heart, but I did not have a lot of success with it. But I do agree with you. I think Metal, I think Grass is maybe above that. Colorless has recently gotten some like, added buff
Iron
to
Jugulus,
it. Yeah, so I think that's where I'm at. But obviously, let's just go with the real answer. Fairy, like you said, there's really nothing in Fairy. All right, you're playing spread, and you have a good matchup into spread. What deck has the best matchup into spread?
Into spread, huh? Anything with Crystal Cave or Rough Seas, like we said before. I know you say Wailord, but I don't actually have a big problem against Wailord because I just go around the Wailord until I'm able to Nihilego copy it, or I just completely go around it at all. Or if I leave it till the last prize in the game, it probably already has a lot of spread damage counters on it anyway, so I'll be able to just knock it out later in the game. Anyways, anything with Malolana, that is really bad as well. Just any healing cards. I find damage reduction cards aren't as bad for your spread because there's ways to get around that. But if your opponent's removing a lot of the damage that you've done, or like using Scoop Up Net or other stuff like that to pick up stuff that has damage counters, those are definitely your worst matchups. I don't know if there's a specific type that spread struggles into the most. It'd probably be like a tanky type. I know I always have like close games against Grass, not because they have a ton of healing options, although sometimes they do play heals. It's just because they have so much HP, and those can be tough matchups too. Like I know Torterra, 200? I think it has 200. All the attackers, at least 130. A lot of the support guys, Rillaboom, Venusaur, 160, 170. That's too much HP for you to get through to win a game a lot of the time. But yeah, I would say those are probably the decks you don't want to see if you're playing spread. Anything else, I think a lot of the other decks you actually have a really good matchup into because a lot of the support Pokemon in the format have low HP, and a lot of decks aren't teching for spread, so...
No, I agree with you again there too. I do think Whales is an issue, but again, I was playing Psychic Spread, and that wash energy can just be kind of backbreaking, especially if they just
That's a good point. Yep.
wash energy the Wailord while they've got Rough Seas up, and you're trying to like take it out with a
Oh, if they have both of those, you might as well say goodbye to that game. Yeah.
Right. You got to really rely on like maybe Devo TM in that specific matchup. But Metal's been tough. You mentioned all the damage reduction tools and heal power. Metal has a lot of that, like just kind of inherently within the type. Like even like Zamazenta, just one energy takes 30 less damage. Like it
also has the tank too. Yeah.
Yeah. So I do think Metal, while it is kind of one of the worst spread decks, is probably one of the better decks against spread. Does Metal have a good matchup against most other things? That's a question we might need to ask for another day. Worst types against spread. What do you think? You're playing spread, or you're playing against spread, and you just
Ooh.
don't have a chance. I think there's some types out there that just don't
Give
have a
me give
chance.
me a lightning deck. I'll cook any lightning deck. I feel bad for lightning decks because they have so much offensive power. They do so much damage and can hit bench. Even if it's not a spread deck, they're putting damage on your bench. But they just don't have health. And you just slap a bench barrier down and you're cooking so many of their strategies. And they also kind of struggle against disruption, which a lot of spread decks do. So I think if I'm playing a spread deck, I definitely want to run into a lightning deck that has their low HP, like Dynamotors, because those are free prizes for me. Anything like that. Fairy, I know that's a joke deck too. That has low HP. What else has low HP? Just any guys with low HP, I guess. Fire is not a bad matchup, but I feel like a lot of types do well into fire as well. Yeah, I would say those are the three you'd be most happy to run into. There's probably one that's escaping my mind, but
So I've been playing a lot of Lightning Spread recently, and I think that Dragon is just free.
oh, really?
Which is weird for me to say because back in the day, Drampa used to just feast on spread decks, but like now they've got like Tatsugiri and Dracloak, which are way lower HP Pokemon, and if you're spreading 50 twice over the course of 2 turns, they might even be helping you out by playing, the stadium that damages their own Pokemon or Rainbow Energy to a certain degree. Again,
That's a good point, yeah.
250 spreads plus a Tapu Koko plus Regieleki just wipes the entire board. And they just don't have any bench barrier. Like Lux Cape, as long as you're saving your Field Blower for their Lux Cape, you can get rid of it. You don't have to worry about it too much. I don't know. I've played the matchup like 3 or 4 times now.
The more Dragon builds like a traditional setup deck with the Dragonite and the Dracloak and all of those guys, I think, yeah, for sure, that better chance you have. I actually haven't played against the new Dragon decks, the ones with the Tatsugiri and the Dracloak. I haven't played against those very much, so I'm more used to the high HP, big basic guys that a spread deck won't want to see. But yeah, if they're running more of the low setup kind of guys and they're not attacking as soon, then I think that is definitely a better matchup for sure, yeah.
I felt really bad for my last opponent because he started Applin, which is like 40 HP, and then the Flapple's like 80, so it's like doesn't even
free
really
prize
matter too
cards.
much.
Yep.
Yeah, so felt really bad for my opponent there, but Dragon's HP's gotten lower with the new cards. Like it's gotten a big buff, but it's come at a little bit of a cost. So that's where I'm at. But I am with you. Lightning into Lightning Spread is probably one of the worst matchups across the board. The poor Dynamo, 30 HP for retreat. Got to play him, but he's there. Well, Watto, thanks for joining me, man. It has been a hoot talking spread, talking Turbo Fairy, talking Dusk Buddies with you. It's been awesome, man.
It was a good time. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course.
Hope everybody listening enjoyed too.
Oh, I'm sure they did. I mean, I enjoyed it. I listened back to these multiple times, and all I can say is each one has been better than the last, and I think this one might be one of our best ones. But I'm a spread guy, so I could talk about spread for hours.
We love spread.
This one, I just want to be spreading all day. Like, that's what it is. And my opponents don't want me to do it. Just stop playing bench barrier, guys. I know I tell people to play bench barrier. Stop playing bench barrier. Let me have fun. Ban bench barrier. Problem solved. Well, before we go, Watto, we got one shout out. Cardboard Warriors Asynchronous League is still going. I think we're in week 3. So again, you haven't hopped on that train. You're looking to qualify for the finals that has a Hall of Fame spot on the line. Hop in, play some types. There's a lot of types that haven't been kind of finalized yet. I think Dragon has low winds. Dark is still up in the air. I think the Psychic people always run away with Psychic at the beginning. So if you're looking to play Psychic, maybe not so much, but get in there if you haven't. All you got to do is jump into the Cardboard Warriors Discord, ping the @GLC League LFG role, and start looking for games at your own leisure. And again, all you have to do is report them. You don't have to sign up or anything like that. It's really awesome. It's really sweet. And again, we got at least 4 more weeks for you to rank up as many points as you can before we have our finals. So check it out if it's something you're interested in. A lot of people playing. Watto, Season 1, I remember you ran away with your Dusk Buddies build. I think was the overall points getter. It was really awesome to see.
Yeah, I think that might have been the one where I played against Phoenix's colorless list in the final. But yeah, it's definitely a good time. If you don't, I know I haven't had a locals for a while for GLC. If you don't have a way to play in person, webcam, great alternative. There's definitely a lot of people looking to play those games. So if you want to get into it, definitely check out the Cardboard Warriors Discord. There's lots of people looking for games there all the time.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Watto, again, thank you so much for joining us to talk all things Spread, Dusk Buddies, and Fairy. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. See you guys later.
All right, everyone else, thank you again for listening to Let Loose, the podcast dedicated to all things Gym Leader Challenge and the Pokemon TCG.